The storm hammered the small duplex as though it meant to tear the house from its foundation. Rain slashed against the windows in relentless sheets. Thunder boomed so loud the kitchen table trembled beneath David Mensa's elbows. He sat hunched there, shoulders sagging, his hand clutching an envelope emblazoned with angry red letters. Final notice. The electricity bill glared up at him like a condemnation, a reminder that life had shrunk from architectural blueprints and ambitious designs to the simple question of whether he could keep the lights on another month. The microwave clock glowed 9:47 p.m. He rubbed at his temples. At that hour, in that weather, the world should have been shuttered. Yet when the doorbell chimed, sharp, jarring, cutting through the thunder like a blade through cloth, David flinched so hard he nearly dropped the bill. For a long moment he sat frozen. No one visited him anymore, least of all at night. His neighborhood was not the kind where one welcomes surprise knocks after dark. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The bell rang again. Reluctantly, heart hammering, David pushed himself up and padded toward the door. Each clap of thunder rattled his bones. Through the peephole, he squinted into the storm-slashed porch light. Two figures stood huddled together, their silhouettes blurred by rain. As lightning flared, he caught details. Young women, both with braids plastered to their heads, shoulders hunched as they clung to one another against the gale. A warning voice inside hissed that it could be a trick, a setup. But another voice, quieter, deeper, stirred in his chest. Their posture wasn't predatory. It was lost, desperate, almost childlike. Against his better judgment, he slid the chain across and cracked the door an inch. "Can I help you?" His tone was cautious but not unkind. The taller of the two lifted her face. Even in the dim glow, her eyes shone dark and wide, filled with such raw desperation that David's breath hitched. "Please, sir. Forgive us for disturbing you," she said, her voice trembling. "Our car broke down nearly a mile away. We've been walking in this storm for hours. We tried every house but no one answered. We just need to use your phone to call for help." David studied them. They couldn't have been more than 22. Identical features marked them as twins, but it was their eyes that struck deepest, terrified, pleading. He was suddenly assaulted by memory. Zara, his 6-year-old daughter, waking from a nightmare, clinging to his neck with the same wide-eyed plea. He hadn't held her in months. The second twin spoke, her words almost swallowed by the rain. "We tried calling for a tow, but the storm must have killed the service. We don't have cash for a cab or a motel. Please, we're freezing." Her voice cracked, more fragile than the storm was fierce. David's instincts roared. Logic screamed to shut the door, to protect what little he had. But another vision intruded. Tariq, his 8-year-old son, stranded somewhere strange, turned away by house after house. What if it were his children begging in the rain? What if no one answered? He sighed, voice gruff. "Wait here." He shut the door just long enough to unhook the chain, then pulled it open. The storm surged in like a furious beast, soaking his shirt in seconds. "Come in. Quickly." Relief flooded their faces. "Thank you," they breathed in unison, stepping into the modest warmth of his home. Their gratitude was so naked that David felt his eyes sting. The living room looked pitiful under their gaze. Second-hand couch, peeling wallpaper, heater wheezing like an old man climbing stairs. Yet when David fetched 2 worn towels, the sisters received them as though he had offered gold. "I'm David," he said awkwardly. "I'm Layla," the taller one replied, clutching the towel to her chest. She gestured to her sister. "This is Maya. We can't thank you enough. We really thought we'd have to sleep in the car." "Where's the car now?" David asked, shutting the door against the storm's howl. "A mile north," Maya said. "It started grinding, then just died. We don't know this area well. We were looking at property for a friend." Her eyes flickered to her sister. The explanation didn't fit. This neighborhood wasn't where young women in designer boots came to view property. But David didn't press. Privacy was a currency he valued himself. "The phone's in the kitchen," he said, gesturing. Layla tried the landline. After several attempts, she shook her head, shoulders slumping. The storm must have knocked out the lines too. David's heart clenched. He knew the feeling of helplessness, of doors closing one by one. His protective instincts surged. "You can't go back out there," he said firmly. "The forecast says this will rage all night. You'll stay here." The sisters hesitated. "We don't want to impose," Maya murmured, her accent carrying refinement that hinted at privilege. "You're not imposing," David said with a self-deprecating smile. "The couch pulls into a bed. It's not 5-star, but it's warm. Breakfast menu is just cereal and toast, though." For the first time, both women smiled genuinely. The storm outside still raged, but inside, something shifted. His house no longer felt so empty. The storm outside had not lessened. Lightning continued to fork across the sky, its glow spilling through the thin curtains, followed by thunder that rattled the very bones of the small house. Inside, however, warmth slowly began to take root. Layla and Maya sat curled on David's threadbare sofa, their damp clothing clinging to their bodies. Towels wrapped around their shoulders provided little comfort, but the relief on their faces was evident. David busied himself in the kitchen. He hadn't entertained guests in years, yet instinct guided his actions. He filled the kettle with the last of his filtered water and dug out the final 2 tea bags from the tin. They were slightly stale, but they would do. His hands trembled as he set the mugs on the stove, part from nerves, part from the cold drafts seeping through the windows. When he returned to the living room carrying the steaming mugs, the women straightened, gratitude lighting their eyes. He set the mismatched cups on the scarred coffee table, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Everything in his home bore the marks of survival, second-hand, patched, and weary. He braced for polite smiles, but instead they cupped the mugs reverently as though he had offered them fine china. "This is perfect," Maya whispered, inhaling the rising steam. Layla nodded, her lips curving into a tired but genuine smile. "Better than anything we imagined tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Mensah." "David," he corrected softly, settling into the armchair across from them. For a moment, silence filled the room. The storm's roar provided a backdrop, but inside, a fragile bubble of peace held. The women asked about his life, their curiosity gentle, never prying. Normally, David shied from personal questions. Pain clung too close to the surface. Yet something about their presence, their sincerity, invited honesty. Perhaps it was the way their eyes held his without judgment, or perhaps it was the storm outside, creating a cocoon of intimacy. "I used to be an architect," David admitted, his voice rough. "I had my own firm once. We built office buildings, retail spaces, big projects." He trailed off, staring into the steam. "Now, I do freelance drafting whatever I can find." Layla leaned forward slightly. "That still sounds fascinating. What made you want to design buildings?" The question tugged at memories. David saw himself at 20, sketching skylines with reckless ambition, believing he could shape cities. "I wanted to create spaces that mattered," he said slowly. "Places where people felt they belonged. I thought success meant towers and contracts, but it cost me more than I realized." His throat tightened. He hesitated, then forced the words. "I lost my marriage. Naomi, my ex-wife, said I was more invested in blueprints than birthdays. She wasn't wrong. By the time I understood, it was too late." The twins listened quietly, their expressions soft with empathy. He hadn't planned to say more, but the storm and their compassion loosened his tongue. "I have 2 kids," he whispered. "Tarek's 8. Zara just turned 6. They live with their mother now, across the country." His voice cracked. "I call them twice a week. I hear about milestones days later. Zara lost her first tooth last week. I only found out 3 days after. They're growing up without me." Maya's eyes glistened. "That must be painful being so far away." David pressed a hand over his face. Shame and grief tangled inside him. "I miss everything, the soccer games, school plays, bedtime stories. I thought working harder meant providing for them. Instead, I lost them." Layla leaned forward, her tone steady but gentle. "But you're still fighting. That matters. Even when it would be easier to give up, you're still trying to be their father." Her words pierced him, sharper than any rebuke. He looked up, his vision blurred. "They're my whole world," he admitted. "Even if I can't be there every day, I want them to know I never stopped loving them." The room fell into thoughtful silence. Rain pounded against the roof, but inside something shifted. For the first time in years, David felt the crushing weight of isolation lift. He had confessed his deepest regrets to 2 strangers, and instead of recoiling, they had simply stayed. Later, as he pulled blankets from his closet and prepared the couch, he realized how extraordinary it was. Sometimes the kindness we extend to others becomes the very bridge that allows us to open our own locked doors. When dawn arrived, it painted the sky in strokes of pale gold, as if the storm had scrubbed the world clean. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, catching the dust that floated in lazy spirals. For the first time in months, David woke to the sound of voices inside his home. He sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered. Layla and Maya. He rose and padded toward the kitchen, where he found them seated at his wobbly table, mugs between their hands. Their conversation hushed the instant he entered, but their smiles were warm. "Good morning," David said, reaching for the coffee tin. He poured the bitter brew into chipped mugs, apologizing for the lack of sugar. They accepted gratefully. "We slept better than we have in weeks," Layla said, and though her words referred to rest, David sensed something deeper. After a breakfast of toast and the last of his juice, David offered to drive them to their car. They hesitated, a flicker of reluctance crossing their features, but eventually agreed. The drive was short, but silence filled the car. David caught them exchanging glances he couldn't interpret, as though they carried secrets too heavy to share. When they finally reached the spot, he blinked. There it was, a sleek luxury sedan. Its glossy frame looked utterly alien against the cracked pavement of his neighborhood. It was the kind of car that cost more than his duplex. Suddenly, the fine boots and tailored coats made sense. David lifted the hood, inspecting the engine. "Alternator belt snapped," he diagnosed. "You'll need a tow. Nothing you can fix here." Relief crossed their faces when roadside assistance confirmed a truck was on its way. They stood close together, their posture no longer of frightened wanderers but of women accustomed to control. And yet, their gratitude remained raw. Layla stepped forward, pressing a card into David's hand. "If you ever need anything," she said quietly, her eyes bright, "call this number." Anything at all. The card was heavy stock, embossed with elegant lettering. He tucked it into his pocket, unsure what to say. "Thank you," he murmured, though it felt backwards. They were the ones who owed thanks, weren't they? As the tow truck arrived and carried them away, David stood on the sidewalk, rainwater dripping from the trees, his heart hollow. The house would be empty again. But something had shifted inside him. The storm had brought strangers to his door, and in their presence he had remembered what it felt like to be seen. When he returned home, the bills still waited on the table. Yet for the first time in months he faced them with a spark of hope. 2 weeks passed, and the memory of the storm still lingered in David's mind. He had settled back into the quiet rhythm of his days, sketching freelance drafts for modest renovations, answering emails that rarely led to substantial work, and staring too often at the photographs of Tariq and Zara that lined his dresser. The silence in his duplex was once again heavy, but something within him had shifted. The encounter with Layla and Maya had unsettled his loneliness, reminding him that kindness, however small, had the power to breathe life into hollow rooms. On a Tuesday morning, while bent over his drafting table tracing lines for a small renovation project, the doorbell rang. David frowned. It was unusual for visitors to come in the morning, and rarer still for anyone to ring his bell at all. He half expected it to be a delivery. Wiping graphite from his fingers, he opened the door. The sight that greeted him nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. Standing tall on his porch was a man whose presence radiated power, distinguished, broad-shouldered, dressed in an exquisitely tailored suit. His salt and pepper hair was trimmed with meticulous care, and beside him, poised and graceful, stood Layla and Maya. Their faces broke into radiant smiles when they saw David, and for a moment, he wondered if he were dreaming. "Mr. Mensah," the man said warmly, extending a firm hand. "I am Chief Kwame Adu. I believe you've already met my daughters." David's mind raced. The puzzle pieces slammed into place. The luxury sedan, the expensive boots, the polished manners. "You're their father?" he whispered. "I am," Chief Adu said with a steady nod. "And I owe you a debt of gratitude I can never repay." Layla stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "We told him everything, David. About the night of the storm. How you were the only one who opened your door. How you gave us shelter when you had so little yourself." Maya added softly, "We asked him to wait before coming. We needed to be sure about you." David blinked, unsettled. "Sure about what?" Chief Adu's eyes gleamed with both kindness and gravity. "My daughters are excellent judges of character. They insisted on learning more about the man who took them in. And so, I did. I know about your struggles, Mr. Mensah. I know about your custody battles, your financial troubles, your fall from your firm. But what struck me most wasn't your failures. It was the way you acted in the middle of them." David's stomach tightened. Shame flared hot on his skin. His private struggles, laid bare before strangers of wealth and influence, it was unbearable. "Why would you investigate me?" "Because character matters," the chief said firmly. 17 doors were closed to my daughters that night. Yours was the only one that opened. That speaks louder than any resume. Tears pricked David's eyes, though he fought them back. "I almost didn't open it," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I was so tired, so weighed down by everything. I almost pretended I wasn't home." "But you didn't," Layla said, her hand brushing his sleeve. "You chose compassion when it mattered most." Chief Adu reached into his briefcase and drew out a leather-bound folder. He handed it to David with deliberate care. Inside is an offer. A position as senior project architect at Adu Development Group. The salary is substantial, the project's meaningful. This isn't charity, Mr. Mensah. It is recognition. You have skill, but more importantly you have heart. That is what we need. David stared at the folder as though it were fire in his hands. His breath came shallow. This can't be real. It is very real, the chief assured him. Take your time, but know this, opportunities like this are rare. I would not make such an offer lightly. Layla's eyes glistened. Say yes, David. Please. In that moment, standing on his porch with the storm now only a memory, David realized life was offering him a doorway. He had been living in ruins, but perhaps it was time to start rebuilding. The folder sat on David's kitchen table for hours after the Adu family left. He stared at it, the leather cover gleaming in the sunlight, its presence heavier than the stack of overdue bills beside it. It promised salvation, yet also stirred a storm of fear within him. For years, he had defined himself by failure. The collapse of his firm, the unraveling of his marriage, the long-distance ache of fatherhood reduced to phone calls and holiday visits. Could he really step back into the role of an architect at that level? Did he deserve such a chance? Or was it just another opportunity he would squander, proving Naomi right all over again? His children's faces floated before him. Zara's missing tooth, Tariq's shy grin. He imagined walking them to school, attending recitals, being present in ways he had only dreamed of. That hope clashed violently with his fear, creating an ache so sharp he pressed a hand to his chest. The phone buzzed. A message from Layla. Don't doubt yourself. You are more than your past. A second followed minutes later from Maya. We believe in you. Believe too. David shut his eyes. Their faith unsettled him, yet it was a buoy he hadn't known he needed. He rose, retrieved a pen and returned to the table. For a long while he simply stared at the folder. Then with trembling hands he opened it. Inside lay a formal contract, printed on crisp pages. His name appeared in bold letters beside the title Senior Project Architect. Below were the terms, salary, relocation support, benefits that seemed almost impossible. His hand shook as he traced the words. Memories surged. The first blueprint he had ever drawn. The long nights at his firm, chasing contracts while Zara cried herself to sleep in Naomi's arms. The shouting matches, the slammed doors, the divorce papers. All of it burned through him like fire. This isn't who I am anymore, he whispered to the empty room. I will not waste this. With a breath that trembled but did not falter, David signed. The pen scratched across the page, sealing a future he had never dared to imagine. That night as he lay in bed, the duplex felt different. The storm had taken so much from him, but perhaps it had also delivered something. 2 sisters at his door, a test of character and a second chance. He drifted into sleep whispering the names of his children, clinging to the hope that soon his world would not be defined by distance but by presence. The leather-bound folder had changed everything. 4 days after signing the contract, David felt as if he were straddling 2 worlds. The life of scarcity that had defined his existence for 3 years, and the new horizon Chief Adu had thrust before him. He still woke up in the small duplex with its peeling wallpaper and groaning heater, but in his hands he now held an employment badge from one of the most prestigious development firms in the country. The transition was swift. Relocation papers arrived within the week, along with arrangements for travel and accommodations. A moving truck carried away the meager belongings David owned, though it felt strange watching the second-hand furniture vanish, leaving behind the hollow rooms that had known his despair. Yet as he turned in the key to his landlord, he felt less grief than he expected. That chapter of his life had been necessary, but it no longer defined him. When he stepped into Adu Development Group headquarters for the first time, he felt small beneath its glass facade. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and expansive windows that flooded the space with light. Receptionists greeted him by name, and colleagues offered polite smiles. It was a world away from his dusty drafting table in the duplex corner. His office, overlooked the city skyline. A clean desk awaited, stocked with tools of his craft. Mechanical pencils, tracing paper, a state-of-the-art drafting computer. For a long moment, David simply stood there, one hand resting on the desk as though anchoring himself to the reality that he was no longer a man surviving on scraps. Yet with the opportunity came fear. Chief Adu's offer wasn't just about designing structures. It was about leading projects that touched communities. His first assignment was ambitious. A community center in a struggling neighborhood. The plans were to include classrooms, recreation facilities and family resource offices, a place meant to stitch together lives unraveling at the seams. David poured himself into the work. Each line he drew, each wall he planned felt symbolic. This wasn't about glossy towers or corporate profits. It was about redemption. In the quiet hours as he sketched late into the evening, he thought of Zara and Tariq. He imagined them walking into the community center one day, their small hands brushing along the walls their father had designed. Perhaps, in building for others, he was also building a bridge back to them. At night, he often returned to his apartment too exhausted to cook. He would sit on the edge of his bed, staring at photos of his children, whispering promises into the silence. Promises that he would not repeat the mistakes of the past. That this second chance was not wasted. That his absence would no longer define their memories of him. One evening, as rain pattered against his new windows, gentler than the storm that had begun all this, he pulled the business card Layla had once given him from his wallet. The embossed letters gleamed under the light. He had not called her since the contract was signed, uncertain whether his gratitude could ever be enough. But now he dialed. "David," Layla's voice answered warmly. "We were wondering when you'd reach out." "I just wanted to thank you," David said quietly. "If not for you and Maya, none of this would have happened." There was a pause, then her voice softened. "You opened the door when no one else did. You don't owe us thanks. You owe your self-belief. And your children." David's chest tightened. She was right. This new doorway wasn't just about survival. It was about tomorrow. By the time a month had passed, David's life looked nothing like the shadow it had been. He was no longer counting coins at the grocery store or shuffling overdue bills into drawers. He was walking into boardrooms, sketching visions on whiteboards, presenting to executives who listened. More astonishingly, he was beginning to believe in himself again. Yet the most important foundation he rebuilt was not architectural. It was personal. Naomi had reluctantly agreed to let Zara and Tariq spend alternate weekends with him in the new apartment provided through his relocation package. The space was modest compared to the Adu estate, but it was filled with light and, more importantly, it was his. He spent nights preparing their rooms, carefully choosing bright bedding for Zara, a bookshelf of comics for Tariq. Every detail mattered because it was proof that he was ready to be the father they needed. The first weekend was unforgettable. Zara squealed with delight at her new room, twirling in her dress before collapsing into his arms. Tariq, quieter but no less joyful, ran his small hand across the bookshelf, his smile shy but radiant. "You did this for us?" he asked. "For you," David confirmed, his throat tightening. "Always for you." They filled the apartment with laughter that night, baking cookies, playing board games, arguing over which movie to watch. When David tucked them into bed, reading a story until Zara's eyes drooped and Tariq's breathing slowed, tears blurred his vision. It was something he had thought he would never experience again. The next morning, they sat together at the small kitchen table, eating pancakes David had burned at the edges but smothered in syrup to hide it. Zara declared them the best pancakes ever, while Tariq snickered but ate 3. In those moments, David felt wealthier than he ever had at the peak of his career. Meanwhile, at work, Chief Adu continued to test him. "You are not here just to design buildings," the chief reminded him one afternoon, walking through the community center blueprints. "You are here to rebuild trust, to remind people that structures can hold dreams, not just walls." David nodded, absorbing the lesson. He understood now. Architecture was not only about steel and glass. It was about lives, families, children. Every choice he made in design was a choice about how people would live, gather, and belong. Evenings were often spent with the Adu family. Sunday dinners became a ritual. Around the polished dining table, Layla teased him about his reluctance to eat spicy food, Maya peppered him with questions about his designs, and Chief Adu observed with a quiet smile. Slowly, David realized he had been woven into a new family as well. Still, shadows lingered. Some nights he lay awake, wondering if he could truly balance his new responsibilities with fatherhood. Fear whispered that success might once again blind him. But then he would recall the storm, the knock at his door, the choice to open it, and he would remind himself that the man who answered that door was different. That man had chosen compassion and he could choose it again every day. Rebuilding foundations wasn't only about projects or apartments. It was about rebuilding himself. And for the first time in years, David believed it was possible. David stood on the doorstep of Naomi's townhouse, his palms slick with sweat despite the crisp evening air. He had faced clients, boardrooms, even the quiet judgment of Chief Adu's piercing gaze, Yet nothing unnerved him as much as the possibility of seeing disappointment in Naomi's eyes again. For 3 years, every conversation had been clipped, businesslike, centered on custody schedules or financial obligations. Tonight was different. Tonight he was here to ask for something more. The door swung open, revealing the woman who had once shared his dreams and his failures. Naomi's beauty had always been understated, but time and resilience had sharpened it into something formidable. Her braids were neatly pulled back, her posture straight, her expression wary. "David," she said, her voice neutral. "Naomi," he replied, forcing steadiness into his tone. "Can I come in?" After a long pause, she stepped aside. The living room was warm and familiar, filled with the soft hum of a heater and the scent of lavender. Family photographs lined the walls, Tariq in his soccer uniform, Zara grinning with a missing tooth, the 2 children beaming on school picture day. David's chest constricted as he took it all in, reminders of the milestones he had missed. "They're in the backyard," Naomi said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the armrest of the couch. "So, what's this about?" David cleared his throat. "I came to talk about the kids. About us. About how things are going to change." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Change? I have a new position," he explained, his voice firm despite the quiver in his chest. "With Edu Development Group. It's steady, it's meaningful, and it gives me the chance to build a life again. Not just for me but for Tariq and Zara." He swallowed hard. "Naomi, I want joint custody. I want to be present in their lives, not just a voice on the phone or a visitor during holidays." Her arms tightened across her chest. Her eyes, so often warm in the past, were sharp now, defensive. "You think a job changes everything? Do you have any idea what it's been like these last years? Zara crying because you missed another birthday call. Tariq stopping himself from asking when you'd visit because he already knew the answer. You weren't there, David. You don't just erase that with a shiny new office." Her words struck like blows, each one true, each one deserved. David forced himself not to look away. "You're right," he said quietly. "I failed them. And I failed you. I let my ambition consume me until I had nothing left but regrets. But I've changed. I know it will take time for you to believe me, but please, let me show them, and you, that I am not the same man who walked away from birthdays and bedtime stories. Let me fight for them. Let me be their father again." Silence filled the room, broken only by the muffled laughter of their children playing outside. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, though her voice remained steady. "And what happens when the work consumes you again? When deadlines matter more than Tariq's soccer game or Zara's recital? What then?" David's throat tightened. He took a deep breath. "Then I choose differently. I've learned what happens when I put work above family. I lost everything that mattered. I won't make that mistake again. This job, it isn't just about buildings. It's about communities, families, people. It's a second chance, and I'll be damned if I waste it." Naomi studied him, searching his face for cracks, for insincerity. She found only a man stripped bare, his pride gone, his heart raw. At last she exhaled, her shoulders lowering. "I'm not doing this for you," she said finally. "I'm doing it for them. They need their father, if you're truly ready to be him." Relief crashed over David like a wave, so overwhelming his knees nearly buckled. He blinked back tears and nodded. "Thank you. I promise, Naomi. I won't let them down again." At that moment, the sliding glass door opened and Tariq bounded in, soccer ball under his arm, Zara trailing behind with grass stains on her leggings. "Daddy!" they cried together, racing into his arms. The sheer force of their embrace nearly knocked him over. Naomi watched quietly, her expression unreadable, but she didn't interrupt. For the first time since their divorce, she allowed space for hope. And for David, that fragile opening was more precious than any contract. It was the beginning of trust rebuilt, brick by brick, choice by choice. David's apartment looked different that Saturday morning, transformed by his nervous energy into something resembling a home. He had spent the entire previous evening scrubbing every surface until his hands were raw, rearranging furniture so the living room looked less cramped, and shopping for small touches that might impress his children. A vase of sunflowers, Zara's favorite, brightened the kitchen table. A shelf stacked with comic books and puzzles waited for Tariq. On the couch, neatly folded blankets promised warmth for movie night. He checked the clock for the 10th time in 15 minutes. Each tick deepened the tension in his chest. It had been years since his children had spent more than a few hours in his care, and even though Naomi had agreed reluctantly, the responsibility felt monumental. This wasn't just about a weekend. It was a test of his readiness, his reliability, his ability to prove that he could be present in ways he had failed before. When the knock finally came, his breath caught. He opened the door to find Tariq and Zara standing there, overnight bags slung over their shoulders, their eyes wide with excitement. Naomi stood behind them, her expression still guarded. "Daddy?" Zara squealed, darting forward to wrap her arms around his waist. Tariq followed more slowly, but his smile stretched across his face as he hugged David tightly. The sensation of their small bodies pressed against him, their warmth and their laughter filling his ears, was almost too much. He blinked back tears as he knelt to meet them at eye level. "Welcome home," he said softly. Inside, Zara twirled in the middle of the living room, her braids flying. "It's so bright. Look, Tariq, there's even flowers." Tariq gravitated to the bookshelf, running his fingers reverently over the spines of comics. "You bought these?" "For you," David confirmed, watching their wonder with a mixture of pride and guilt. How many times had he missed opportunities to do such small, meaningful things? Naomi lingered by the door, scanning the apartment with a critical eye. At last she nodded. "Call me if there's anything," she said, her tone clipped. "I'll pick them up Sunday evening." "Of course," David said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions. He wanted to thank her, to promise again, but she had already turned to leave. The door closed with a soft click, leaving father and children alone for the first time in far too long. The weekend unfolded like a long-denied dream. They started with pancakes, slightly burnt at the edges, but drowned in syrup to disguise the char. Zara declared them the best pancakes ever, while Tariq laughed and teased, "Moms are better." David chuckled, grateful even for the gentle ribbing. Later they baked cookies, flour dusting Zara's cheeks while Tariq sneakily ate spoonfuls of dough. They played board games, Zara triumphant at each victory while Tariq plotted strategies with serious concentration. In the afternoon, David took them to the park nearby, pushing them on the swings until his arms ached, chasing Tariq in mock soccer drills, and watching Zara attempt cartwheels on the grass. By evening they returned home, exhausted but giddy. David set up blankets on the couch, popping popcorn for a movie marathon. Zara nestled against his side while Tariq leaned on his shoulder. Halfway through the second movie, David realized both children had fallen asleep, their heads resting on him. His throat tightened as he muted the television and simply sat there, feeling the rise and fall of their breathing, the warmth of their trust. Carrying them to their beds later, he lingered by each one, tucking them in with a tenderness that felt both foreign and familiar. He whispered over them, "I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." Lying awake in his own room, he thought of the storm that had started it all. If he had ignored that knock, if he had closed his heart in fear, he would not be here now, listening to the soft sighs of his children in the next room. Life had tested him in the harshest ways, but for the first time in years he felt he was passing. The weekend ended too soon. Naomi arrived Sunday evening, punctual as always. Zara clung to his arm, insisting she didn't want to leave, while Tariq quietly packed his comics into his bag. Naomi's eyes softened at the sight of their reluctance, though she said nothing. As they walked out, Zara turned back at the door. "We'll come again, right, Daddy?" David knelt, kissing her forehead. "Every other weekend," he promised. "And one day even more." When the door closed behind them, silence fell heavy again. But it was no longer the suffocating emptiness of before. It was the silence of anticipation, of a life slowly being rebuilt. He looked around the apartment, flowers wilting, crumbs scattered on the counter, comic books askew, and for once the mess brought him joy. It was evidence of presence, of family, of love returning piece by piece. David lay down that night with a peace he had not known in years. The storm had not destroyed him. It had carried him to shore. The weeks following that first weekend with his children were some of the most meaningful of David's life. He settled into the rhythm of fatherhood, balancing school runs, weekend visits, and bedtime calls with late nights at his drafting table. For the first time in years he no longer felt like he was drifting. His life had a center again. Yet with each step forward, new challenges waited. One afternoon, as he worked in the Overdue Development Group's headquarters, his office door opened without a knock. Chief Kwame Overdue himself strode in, a quiet authority surrounding him like an invisible cloak. His salt and pepper hair gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, and his sharp eyes scanned the blueprints David had spread across his desk. "You're working late," the chief observed, his voice both warm and commanding. David straightened. "Just refining the design for the East End Community Center. I want to make sure it's functional and welcoming." The chief studied him for a moment before pulling up a chair. "I have been watching you, David. Not just your designs but your choices. You are talented, yes, but skill is not what I am testing. David frowned slightly. Testing? Yes, the chief said simply. The storm that brought my daughters to your door was not an accident. Life has a way of revealing character in moments of crisis. That night you passed the first test. But now, I must know if you can hold on to that same heart when given responsibility, resources, and power. The words sank into David like stones. He remembered the years when his ambition had consumed him, when Naomi's pleas had gone unheard, when Zara's cries had been muffled behind closed doors while he chased contracts. I understand, he said quietly. The chief leaned forward, his hands clasped. We are expanding into rural areas. Places neglected by both government and developers. I want you to lead one of these initiatives. It will not be glamorous. The pay will be no more than what you earn now. But it will test your priorities. Will you choose convenience or will you choose people? David's throat tightened. I want to help. But what if I fail again? Chief Adu's gaze softened. Failure is not the worst outcome. Indifference is. My daughters saw something in you, a man who still cared even when he had every reason not to. That is why I trust you. David exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of Zara and Tariq, of how he had promised Naomi that he would not put work above them again. Could he balance it all? Could he build for others without losing what he was rebuilding at home? Layla and Maya visited later that evening, joining their father in his office. We heard, Maya said, her eyes sparkling with encouragement. This is your chance to prove not just to him but to yourself that you are ready. Layla added gently, 17 doors were closed, David. You opened yours. That's the kind of man who can lead this project. Their faith in him stirred something deep within. For years he had lived defined by doubt and regret. Now, 2 young women and their father were reminding him that compassion was not weakness, it was strength. I'll do it, David said finally, his voice firm. I'll take the project. The chief's lips curved into a rare smile. Good. Then your real work begins. That night, David returned to his apartment exhausted but restless. He looked at the drawings pinned above his desk, blueprints of community centers, sketches of safe spaces for children. He imagined Tariq running across a gymnasium he had designed, Zara reading books in a sunlit corner of a library built by his hands. He knew the road ahead would be hard. But for the first time the challenge didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with purpose. As he drifted to sleep, he whispered into the darkness, "This time I'll get it right." David's calendar grew crowded in ways he had both longed for and dreaded. On one side of his life was the East End Community Center project, a test of his skill and heart, where each meeting with city officials and each site visit demanded patience and creativity. On the other side were Tariq and Zara, whose laughter now filled his weekends, whose needs reminded him daily why this second chance mattered. At work, David stood before blueprints spread across a long oak table in a conference room. Engineers, planners and junior architects clustered around, waiting for his lead. He gestured at the layout with a pencil. We need to maximize the natural light in this wing. Families will gather here, a library, tutoring rooms. It has to feel welcoming, not clinical. One engineer frowned. That'll increase costs. David inhaled slowly. He remembered Chief Adu's words. Will you choose convenience or will you choose people? Then we'll adjust elsewhere. Trim the facade budget. A community center isn't judged by how it looks from the street, but how it feels inside. After the meeting, as his colleagues packed up, Layla appeared at the door. She leaned against the frame, a teasing smile on her lips. That was impressive. Father will be pleased. David chuckled, though his shoulders sagged with fatigue. I hope so. But sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough. Every hour here feels like an hour stolen from my kids. Her expression softened. You're doing this for them too, you know. You're showing them that their father builds more than buildings. He builds futures. That weekend, David proved her right. Tariq begged him to come to his soccer game, and though the timing meant leaving a drafting session unfinished, David chose the field. Standing on the sidelines, he cheered so loudly that Zara laughed and covered her ears. When Tariq scored a goal, his grin was brighter than the stadium lights. David knew without doubt that this moment mattered more than any meeting. But the balancing act was grueling. Late Sunday night, after tucking Zara into bed and listening to Tariq's recount of his game, David returned to his apartment and collapsed at the drafting table. Papers sprawled around him, deadlines loomed, and fatigue blurred his vision. For a fleeting second, panic whispered that he might crumble again, that he couldn't carry both worlds. Then he looked at the drawings. Open spaces filled with children, families gathered under roofs he had designed. And beside them, taped carefully, were two crayon sketches Zara had made, one of a house labeled Daddy's Home, the other of a stick figure family holding hands. David straightened, resolve surging. He could carry both worlds because they were no longer separate. His work, his children, his redemption, they were intertwined, each giving meaning to the other. The following Sunday, David found himself at the sprawling Overdue estate, a ritual that had quickly become part of his new life. The estate stood like a testament to wealth and vision, its manicured gardens stretching wide, fountains glimmering in the sun. But within its walls, the air was surprisingly warm, laughter, debate, and the smell of spices drifting from the kitchen. Layla greeted him at the door with her usual wit. "You're late. We were about to send out a search party." "I brought dessert," David replied, lifting a box of pastries. Maya appeared behind her sister, rolling her eyes. "Store-bought, of course. One day you'll learn to cook properly." David laughed, though the banter masked his nerves. He still felt like an outsider sometimes, seated at a table far grander than anything he had known, dining with a family that had adopted him in spirit. Yet Chief Overdue approving nods and the sister's constant teasing reminded him he belonged. Dinner was lively. Between bites of jollof rice and grilled chicken, conversation flowed about politics, culture, and the progress of the East End project. Chief Overdue turned to David at one point, his gaze steady. "I hear you attended your son's soccer game instead of staying late at the office." David's stomach clenched. "Yes, sir." Good," the chief interrupted, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "Buildings can wait. Children cannot." Relief flooded David. Across the table, Layla winked, while Maya clapped her hands in mock applause. After dinner, the group gathered in the sitting room. Chief Overdue poured himself a glass of wine and leaned back. "Do you know why my daughters knocked on 17 doors that night before reaching yours?" he asked. David shook his head. "Because life tests us in the most ordinary ways. Many speak of compassion, but few practice it when it costs them comfort. You opened your door, David, and that choice is why you sit here now. Remember it always." The words sank deep into David's chest, heavier than any praise. He realized then that the chief wasn't merely a benefactor. He was a mentor, shaping David not just into a better architect, but into a better man. Later, as David drove home, the night sky stretched wide above him. His children were asleep in Naomi's house across town, and the project deadlines loomed for Monday. Yet his heart was steady. He was no longer a man defined by loss. He was a man rebuilding, foundations at work, foundations at home, foundations within himself. The East End project moved from sketches to groundwork, and David soon realized that building on paper was far different from bringing dreams into reality. The neighborhood where the community center was planned had been neglected for years. Empty lots lay scarred with weeds, buildings leaned tiredly against one another, and residents wore faces etched with caution. As David walked the site one early morning, clipboard in hand, he felt both the magnitude of the task and the fragility of hope. A group of residents had gathered, watching the survey team mark boundaries. A woman in her 50s stepped forward, her arms crossed. "Another development? We've heard this story before. Promises made, promises broken. Why should we believe this one will be any different?" David met her gaze. He could have recited corporate reassurances, but instead he spoke plainly. "Because I live what you live. I know what it means to be promised the world and left with scraps. I can't change the past, but I can design something real, something for your children and mine." There was silence, then a skeptical murmur through the crowd. The woman didn't smile, but her expression softened. "We'll see." Back at headquarters, the pressure mounted. Budgets were tight, deadlines unforgiving. One afternoon, an executive slammed a report onto the table during a meeting. "We can't keep these windows David keeps pushing for. Too expensive. Families don't need skylights." David felt heat rise in his chest. "They need dignity. Natural light transforms a space. It tells children they're worth more than bare concrete." The executive scoffed. "This isn't charity." "No," David replied evenly. "It's community. And if we strip it down until it feels like a cage, we've failed before we even open the doors." The room went quiet. Slowly, Chief Overdue nodded. "Keep the windows," he said. Later, in the solitude of his office, David stared at the blueprints. His hands trembled, not from doubt but from the weight of responsibility. If this project faltered, it would not be a mark against the company alone. It would be against him, against the trust the community had cautiously placed in his words. That weekend he sat with Tariq and Zara on the floor of his apartment, crayons scattered around them. "Help me design something," he said, sliding sheets of paper across. Zara drew a playground with slides and swings. Tarek sketched a soccer field. They handed their creations to him proudly, and he pinned them to his wall beside the blueprints. "Then that's what we'll build," he said, his voice thick. The project was no longer just lines on paper. It was his children's dreams and the community's fragile hope, bound together. And David knew he could not let those foundations crack. One quiet evening, David was in his apartment preparing dinner when a knock came at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and when he opened it, surprise froze him in place. Naomi stood there, her arms folded, her eyes cool but not hostile. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course," David said, stepping aside quickly. She entered, scanning the apartment as though measuring the life he had built since their separation. The once empty rooms were now filled with signs of children. Zara's stuffed animals piled on a chair, Tarek's soccer cleats by the door, drawings taped proudly to the fridge. The scent of tomato stew simmered on the stove. Naomi's expression softened, though she tried to hide it. "The kids talk about this place constantly. Zara says you read her 3 stories in one night. Tarek said you cheered louder than anyone at his game." David smiled faintly. "I'm trying to make up for lost time." Naomi's gaze lingered on him. "They notice, and so do I. But I need to know, David, is this permanent? Or is this just another sprint before you collapse back into old habits?" Her words stung, but he understood. He gestured to the table where blueprints lay scattered among crayons. "I'm balancing both now. My work isn't about skyscrapers anymore. It's about places where children grow, where families connect. I've learned that building a life means more than building walls." She studied him silently, then walked to the wall where Zara and Tarek's drawings hung. She touched them lightly as if weighing their meaning. "They deserve consistency," she said softly. "Not weekends of magic followed by weeks of absence." "They'll have consistency," David promised. "I won't let them down again." For a long moment, Naomi's guard lowered, revealing the weary mother beneath. "You've changed," she admitted quietly. "And maybe I've changed too. I don't forgive the past easily, but I can see the effort now. Keep showing me, David. Keep showing them." They sat down to dinner together, the atmosphere tentative but warmer than it had been in years. The children weren't there, yet their presence filled every corner of the apartment. As Naomi left that night, she paused at the door. "If you keep this up, I'll consider revising custody terms. For now, let's take it one step at a time." When the door closed, David leaned against it, his heart pounding. For years he had carried guilt like chains. Now for the first time he felt those chains loosening. Not gone, not yet, but loosening. The storm that had once torn his life apart had delivered more than strangers seeking shelter. It had delivered a second chance, one he was determined not to squander. The day of the East End Community Center's groundbreaking dawned clear and golden, as though the skies themselves wanted to bless the work. David arrived early, his heart hammering as he stepped onto the lot that would soon hold walls, classrooms, and laughter. Months of drafts, late nights, and sleepless worry had led to this morning. The ground still smelled of rain from a shower the night before, damp earth rich with promise. Construction crews were already assembling, setting up barriers and arranging the podium where speeches would be made. Soon, city officials, community leaders, and edu development executives would gather. For now, though, David stood alone at the edge of the lot, staring at the wide-open space. He imagined what it would look like in a year. Children racing across the playground Tarek had sketched, families sitting together under skylights that Zara's doodles had inspired, teenagers reading in quiet corners where sunlight poured through tall windows. A voice broke into his thoughts. "You look like a man staring at his future." David turned to see Chief Kwame Adu approaching, his suit immaculate as always, his presence commanding. Layla and Maya walked just behind, both beaming with pride. "It feels bigger than my future," David admitted. "It feels like there's this community, my children, everyone who needs a place to feel safe." The chief nodded approvingly. "That is why you were chosen. Not because of your skills, though you have many, but because you remembered that buildings must hold people, not egos." Before David could reply, a pair of small voices called out, "Daddy." Tarek and Zara came running across the lot, their sneakers kicking up dirt, Naomi following at a slower pace. David bent and swept them both into his arms, laughing as their joy spilled over. Tarek's soccer jersey was streaked with grass stains, Zara's braids bounced as she clung to his neck. Naomi stopped a few steps away, her arms crossed but her eyes softer than they had been in years. "They insisted on being here," she said. "I figured, it's important." David's chest tightened. "Thank you." The ceremony began shortly after. Officials spoke of revitalization, of economic opportunity, of growth. But when David was invited to the podium, he paused, scanning the crowd. He saw residents who had doubted him months before, now gathered with cautious hope. He saw his children sitting proudly beside Naomi. And he saw the Overdue family, their faith in him shining. He cleared his throat. 3 years ago I lost nearly everything. My marriage, my firm, my confidence. I thought success was about building higher towers and earning bigger contracts. But I was wrong. Success is measured here, he gestured at the lot, in the spaces where children play, where families gather, where neighbors find dignity. His voice thickened, but he pressed on. When my children look at this building, I want them to see more than walls. I want them to see a reminder that their father chose compassion when it mattered, and that compassion changed everything. This is not just a community center. It is proof that storms can break us, but they can also bring us together. Applause rippled across the crowd. David stepped down from the podium, his hands trembling, his heart light. Together with Chief Overdue and a handful of city leaders, he pressed the ceremonial shovel into the earth. Cameras flashed, cheers rose, and David felt something inside him settle. He was no longer the man who lived in regret. He was the man rebuilding foundations. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Naomi approached him quietly. "You spoke well," she said. David nodded. "I meant every word." She glanced at their children, then back at him. "I believe you." Those 3 words were more precious than any applause. They were a key unlocking a door he thought would stay shut forever. That evening, after dropping Tariq and Zara back at Naomi's, David was invited to the Overdue estate for Sunday dinner. Around the table, laughter bubbled, stories flowed, and the warmth of belonging wrapped around him. Layla teased him about his awkward speech delivery, Maya insisted he had won the crowd, and the chief raised his glass. To David Mensah, the chief declared, "A man who opened his door in a storm and in doing so opened a future." David's throat tightened as everyone clinked glasses. He lifted his own and said softly, "To grace, the kind that finds us when we least expect it." When he returned to his apartment that night, the space no longer felt empty. The flowers on the table were fresh, the walls lined with both professional blueprints and childish crayon drawings. He sat at his drafting table not to chase deadlines, but to sketch a vision of tomorrow, one filled with soccer games, bedtime stories, Sunday dinners, and buildings that held not just people but hope. As he laid his pencil down, a memory flickered, the doorbell ringing through the storm, 2 soaked figures shivering on his porch, and his hand hovering over the chain. What if he hadn't opened the door? He whispered to the quiet room, "Thank God I did." For the first time in years, David turned off the light with peace in his heart. His foundations were no longer cracked. They were steady, anchored in love, rebuilt by grace.